Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Akbari, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar in the Ethiopian Studies series hosted by the Institute for Advanced Study. The series is co-convened by Aaron Butts, Samantha Kelly, Sabina Schmidtke, and myself. Today's webinar is on the topic of the Beta Israel and Ethiopian Christian views of Jews and Judaism. Later webinars in the series this year will be on the topic of the intersection of Ethiopian studies with other fields, including medieval studies, and on Islamic manuscripts and intellectual traditions in Ethiopia. Before turning to today's panelists, who will reflect on the historical past, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on events in Ethiopia today. I know that I speak for all of us in saying that we hope the current conflict soon comes to a peaceful end, and that we deeply regret the loss of life that we've witnessed over these past days. Today's panel will be moderated by Samantha Kelly, professor of history at Rutgers University and member this year at IIS's School of Historical Studies, where she's writing a book on Ethiopian and European collaborations during the 16th century. I won't take the time to detail her accomplishments, but will just take note of her wonderful new edited collection, The Companion to Medieval Ethiopia and Eritrea, which appeared from Brill earlier this year. I'll also be keeping the time and helping with the question period. So over to you, Samantha.
Thank you, Suzanne. And with thanks again to my other co-organizers, Erin and Sabine. Welcome to today's webinar. Our subject today is the Beta Israel, a community in Ethiopia whose origins are elusive and therefore have been open over time to different interpretations. It can be said that they are first attested in Ethiopian sources written by their antagonists, as Ayhud, Jews, or occasionally Kama Ayhud, people like Jews, in the 14th and 15th centuries. And this moment has, in the last few decades, been accepted by many as the moment when the Beta Israel coalesced into a distinctive community or set of communities, generally north and east of Lake Tana. Subject to persecution, but also sometimes alliance and patronage on the part of the Christian kings in these first centuries of 14th, 15th, 16th, the Beta Israel suffered increasing social marginalization as time went on, generally barred from landholding and relegated to low status professions, in which they nevertheless carved out a role for themselves and maintained their distinctive way of life. Protestant and Jewish missionary activity in the 19th and 20th centuries brought the Beta Israel to the attention of the worldwide community, resulting in the first recordings of Beta Israel oral tradition and music, and the first collections of Beta Israel manuscripts abroad, and led eventually to the famous operations from 1980 to 1991 that transported tens of thousands of Beta Israel to the State of Israel. You already have short biographies of our four panelists on the flyer, so in the interests of not taking up too much time with introductions, let me just say the briefest word about each in the order in which they will be speaking. Steve Kaplan, chaired Professor Emeritus of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University, has a career too long and illustrious to even begin to summarize, so I will just say he has written extensively on Ethiopian history, from the classic Monastic Holy Man in Ethiopia, to works on conversion, on childhood, on time, on the Ethiopian diaspora, and of course extensively on the Beta Israel, both in Ethiopia and in Israel, having written one of the foundational monographs and many articles on the subject. Sophia Degemüller is attached to both the Hiob Ludov Center of Ethiopian Studies in Hamburg, Germany, and the Center for Religious Studies in Bochum, Germany. A specialist of Ethiopian manuscript studies, who has also worked on the complement to manuscripts materiality, that is, oral tradition, she has done groundbreaking research on Beta Israel manuscripts, some of which has been published this year in the Comparative Oriental Manuscript Studies Bulletin, and about which we will hear today. Aaron Butts, Associate Professor at Catholic University and Director of its Institute of Christian Oriental Research, is a specialist of Semitic languages and cultures. Having written a number of works on Syriac, he just published a book on relations between Syriac Christians and Jews, but also has an abiding interest in Ethiopia in all its cultural facets, from the Quran in Ethiopia, subject of a conference that he recently organized, to Ge'ez, on which he's written a grammar, to the subject of his current project, the narratives surrounding Ethiopia's adoption of Christianity in late antiquity to the Beta Israel, on which he'll speak today. Marcia Kupfer is a specialist of medieval art who has written books on different media, from wall paintings to maps, and on themes ranging from healing to the Passion story. Much of her recent work concerns representations of Jews and Jewish-Christian polemic, and she will bring a comparative perspective on the subject today, drawing on Western European and Ethiopian visual imagery. In the interests of fostering discussion, each panelist will present briefly for 10 to 12 minutes. The panelists will then have a few moments to ask each other questions or point to intersections in their work, after which we'll open the floor to questions from attendees. So if you have a question that you would like to pose to the panelists, please write that question into the chat, right? The chat function is at the bottom of your screen, and indicate please to which panelist your question is directed. Professor Akbari and I will moderate the chat relating your questions to the panelists. So as I think you've realized, because we have many participants, we're now to 225. We've had to disable the video and the voice functions for attendees. So the chat is the place where we will be able to interact with you. Please feel free to check back in with our webpage, where the panelists, if they have more information to offer on our subject, will be able to do so there after our webinar is finished, and where you can also find more information on the webinars to come. Without further ado, I pass over the screen to our first speaker, Steve Kaplan.